What began as a single act of terror in Pahalgam didn't remain just an attack. It became a fault line. In the days that followed, the Indus Water Treaty, one of the most enduring agreements between India and Pakistan, was placed in abeyance, and the world watched closely as New Delhi recalibrated its stance. That 1 week changed everything. We saw clearly who stood with us and who merely claimed to. Those choices made then are shaping our economic strategies today, especially in the midst of Trump's tariff wars and the shifting global supply chains. And now we arrive at the final chapter, because for all the talk of ceasefires and peace on paper, the reality on the ground is very different. The silence at the border isn't peace, it's a held breath, a pause before a larger move. But before we talk about what happens next, we need to go back. Back to a time when India and Pakistan were still trying to coexist. To understand why the Indus Waters Treaty became the only thread holding that fragile peace together. Because only when we understand what this treaty meant can we understand what suspending it means today. And why this move, seen by many as symbolic, is in reality a slow, silent, and strategic chokehold on Pakistan's survival. When India and Pakistan were split in 1947, the Radcliffe Line didn't just divide land, it divided rivers. The Indus Basin, a system that had sustained civilizations for thousands of years, suddenly had its headwaters in India, but its canals and fertile plains in Pakistan. Overnight, Pakistan became a nation whose agriculture, drinking water, and electricity were dependent on water flowing from territory it no longer controlled. In April 1948, just months after partition, India temporarily paused water flow from the Firozpur headworks to Pakistan-controlled areas. It lasted only a few weeks, but it was enough for Pakistan to realize something chilling. Without a negotiated agreement, India could turn off the tap whenever it wants. In 1960, the Indus Waters Treaty was signed, and here's what made it extraordinary. India got full rights over the eastern rivers Ravi, Beas, and Satluj. Pakistan got full rights over the western rivers Indus, Jhelum, Chenab. This meant Pakistan received nearly 80% of the total water flow. India, despite being the upstream power, agreed to let Pakistan have the larger share. And not just that, India also paid to help Pakistan build dams and canals to use that water effectively. In many ways, you can call this treaty an act of peace building or giving away your leverage too quickly. But one thing was clear. This water arrangement became the silent peacekeeper. As long as the rivers flowed, conversations continued, however tense they were. Which brings us to today. For the first time in history, that silence has been broken. And the moment water stops being shared, it stops being water and becomes power. And the fact that the treaty remains in abeyance to this day is the clearest sign that the conflict is not over. Now let's take a look at what has happened since India took this quiet, calculated pause. Hydropower projects that were stalled for decades are now moving forward. Projects like Sawalkote, Kirthai 1 and 2 and multiple smaller but strategically critical dams across the Chenab and Jhelum valleys are now operationally greenlit. Together, these could add about 10,000 megawatts of clean energy generation to Jammu and Kashmir alone. Desilting operations began at Salal and Baglihar, restoring reservoirs to their original capacity. This means more storage, more electricity, and more seasonal water control. India has also begun re-optimizing older dams such as Uri, Dulhasti, Nimu Basgo, and Shutak, improving their ability to regulate river flow. Meanwhile, across the border, Pakistan is facing the hydrological equivalent of a heart attack. With 80% of its water supply depending on the Indus Basin, even minor reductions in flow have triggered major consequences. Reservoirs are dropping towards dead storage, irrigation channels are drying prematurely, Punjab's crop yields have fallen over 20%, drinking water shortages are hitting major cities, and ironically, poor water management has created both floods and droughts in the same year. This is not merely a water issue, it is a national stability issue. Because a nation that cannot water its fields cannot feed its people, and a nation that cannot feed its people cannot govern them. And Pakistan is living it in real time. Now, as the Indus Water Treaty stays in abeyance, the structural fault lines inside Pakistan are getting exposed. Balochistan, rich in resources, exploited for the same. Khyber, militarized but not integrated. Sindh, resentful of Punjab's monopoly on power, and Punjab, ruling the state but unable to hold it together. These tensions were manageable as long as the Indus River kept flowing. When the water slowed, the grievances ignited. Starting with Sindh.
Now, protests against the controversial canal project on the river Indus have continued to paralyze cross-country traffic in several parts of Pakistan's Sindh.
Sindh is a downstream province, which means it relies on water flowing from the northern regions through the Indus system. With reduced river flows and mismanagement in distribution, many communities in Sindh are simply not receiving enough water for drinking, daily use, or even agriculture. For a region where a large part of the population depends on farming to earn a living, this hits directly at income and survival. People felt that the federal government and the upstream province Punjab are receiving a larger share of water, while Sindh is being left to struggle. This has made existing feelings of neglect and regional imbalance even stronger. So when water became scarce, the frustration wasn't just about shortages. It was about the belief that the system is unfair, that their needs are not being taken seriously, and that those in power are not responding with urgency. That's why people came out onto the streets now to make a political statement and demanding a separate homeland. Now let's move on to the infamous seat of the Taliban, the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa.
Pakistan's federal government is withholding funds allocated to Khyber Pakhtunkhwa within the framework of the ongoing war on terror, along with other constitutionally guaranteed rights.
Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, once known as the Northwest Frontier Province, sits at the crossroads of history and conflict. Stretching across Pakistan's border with Afghanistan, it has long been a geopolitical buffer between two uneasy neighbors. The province's population is predominantly Pashtun, the same ethnic group that spans on both sides of the border, which makes its loyalties and political sentiments deeply intertwined within the dynamics inside Afghanistan. For decades, KP has been the epicenter of militancy and insurgency. Its mountainous terrain, porous borders, and long-standing lack of state presence have allowed militant groups like Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan or TTP to gain a strong foothold. These groups, ideologically aligned with the Afghan Taliban, have challenged Pakistan's authorities, seeking to impose their version of Islamic law and reclaim control over tribal areas. In recent years, the security situation in KP has worsened again. The resurgence of the TTP since 2023 has led to a spike in attacks on security forces and civilians. What makes this round of conflict particularly volatile is its cross-border dimension. Pakistan has accused Afghanistan's Taliban-led government of harboring TTP militants, while Kabul counters that Islamabad continues to carry out airstrikes on Afghan soil. This has turned the Pakistan-Afghanistan border into an active combat zone, with both sides exchanging drone strikes and artillery fire in recent months. The conflict in KP today reflects more than just a local insurgency. It symbolizes Pakistan's deeper struggle to balance internal governance. Now, as Islamabad and Kabul continue to trade blows, the people of KP are once again caught in the crossfire, victims of a war that is both internal and regional, with no clear end in sight. Moving on to Balochistan.
The motive of our attack was very clear. It was a simple and clear message to China and Pakistan to withdraw immediately from Balochistan. China, you came here without our consent, supported our enemies, helped Pakistani military in wiping our villages. But now it's our turn.
Balochistan is Pakistan's largest province by land, yet one of the poorest. Its vast resources, copper, gold, natural gas, fuel the nation, but the locals claim they see little of the wealth. Over the years, this resentment hardened into an armed struggle where BLA cast itself as defenders of Baloch rights, autonomy, and land. On the other side stands the Pakistan military, heavily armed, entrenched, and determined to crush any separatist movement. Islamabad views BLA as a terrorist organization threatening national security, and on the other side, BLA is fighting to protect Balochistan from excessive mining, China's oppression, and China's grand economic ambitions. In the beginning of this year, around March 2025, a BLA J faction stormed the Jafar Express, taking innocent passengers hostage. A botched rescue attempt turned the desert into a war zone, leaving at least 26 civilians dead. For the people of Balochistan, this wasn't just an act of terror. It was another reminder that the land has become the battleground between a separatist rage and a military that refuses to loosen its grip. This leads us to the question why? Because Balochistan is Pakistan's crown jewel, not culturally, not politically, but strategically and economically. Underneath its sand lies gold, copper, gas, and minerals worth billions. Along its coastline sits Gwadar, the shining gateway to China's CPEC dreams. And in every negotiation with global powers, Balochistan is the ace up Pakistan's sleeve, a region so valuable that losing control of it simply is not an option, no matter the cost. This is exactly why the military rules the province with an iron fist, and why groups like the BLA, BLF, and other factions rise again and again. To them, CPEC is not a development, it is extraction. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is China's multi-billion-dollar infrastructure and investment project in Pakistan designed to secure trade routes, energy access, and strategic influence by linking Western China to the Arabian Sea through Gwadar. Mining mega projects like Sendak and Reko Dik feel less like partnerships and more like takeover attempts, where outsiders prosper while locals remain displaced, disappeared, or unheard. And the violence hasn't stopped. In December 2025, BLF fighters clashed with Pakistani forces for over 24 straight hours in Nokundi, near compounds housing foreign engineers. These weren't random attacks, they were symbolic strikes at the heart of what the Baloch see as a systematic stripping of their homeland. Finally, coming to the epicenter of it all, Punjab, the state ruling the country but somehow unable to hold it together. Meanwhile, in Pakistan's Punjab province, another storm is brewing, one that has nothing to do with separatist or border conflicts, but the country's most powerful political force, the streets. The TLP has mobilized massive protests demanding the release of Imran Khan after a new law pushed by Army Chief Asim Munir effectively placed him above the courts, giving him sweeping powers that critics say erode whatever independence the judiciary had left. And then came the spark. Rumors spreading like wildfire that Imran Khan had died in custody. Within hours, crowds flooded the streets, not for politics but demanding something as basic as proof of life. When the government finally allowed his sister to meet him, she emerged with a chilling allegation. Imran Khan was being mentally tortured for information on corruption cases linked to Munir's early career, turning Punjab's political tension into a boiling pot. So now the country isn't just facing unrest in distant corners, chaos has come home. But here's the real question no one is asking. How does a country drowning in political chaos, military overreach, internal insurgencies, and economic decay still find the money and audacity to fund terror organizations? Most nations facing even half of Pakistan's crisis, think Tanzania, Nepal, Sri Lanka, with debt traps and currency freefall, they can't afford to threaten anyone. Yet Pakistan, despite being neck-deep in turmoil, somehow manages to bankroll groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed and continue hostile operations, even going head-to-head with Afghanistan right after Operation Sindoor. So the obvious question becomes, how is Pakistan surviving this prolonged economic freefall? Who's keeping the lights on? This is where the story gets uncomfortable. The answer lies in bailonomics, a polite word for a survival cycle powered by IMF bailouts. And let's be honest, IMF in this region is often USA in disguise. In one of our earlier videos, we broke down on how both the US and China have deep strategic interests in Pakistan. So this was never just about Kashmir. This is geopolitics. This is why Pakistan's economic collapse hasn't collapsed Pakistan. Coming to the last leg of our video, are we finally heading towards a decision on Kashmir, and is Operation Sindoor 2 in the horizon? On November 10, 2025, Delhi's evening rush was unfolding like any other day. Horns, headlights, and the familiar chaos of the city closing its day. But at 6:52 p.m., everything changed. A Hyundai i20 packed with explosives detonated right outside the Red Fort, ripping through the traffic signal and sending a shockwave across the capital. 13 people died, including the suicide bomber, later identified as Dr. Umar Nabi, an assistant professor with impeccable academic credentials but radical ideological roots. It was a moment that stunned investigators. A white-collar terrorist, the face of a worrying new trend where radicalization is no longer limited to remote handlers or uneducated recruits, but slips quietly into our lecture halls, research departments, and university corridors. But the blast was just one part of a far bigger nightmare. Hours before this explosion, the Jammu and Kashmir police intercepted a massive terror operation. 7 suspects linked to Jaish-e-Mohammed and Ansar Ghazwat-ul-Hind were arrested, and what they seized shocked even veteran officers. 2,900 kg of ammonium nitrate. Such a volume is sufficient to destroy multiple buildings, demolish vehicles, and cause extensive damage to surrounding infrastructure. Weapons, electronics, components for multiple car bombs. The operation hinted at a multi-city attack plan, and one that could have even been catastrophic if not intercepted in time. And then things took a darker turn. On November 14th, while forensics teams were examining part of the seized ammonium nitrate at the Navgam police station in Kashmir, an unintended blast tore through the room, killing 9 people on the spot. It wasn't an attack, just the terrifying volatility of the chemical they were dealing with. 2 incidents, 4 days apart, one common thread. The explosive was unstable, dangerously unstable. Investigators now suspect the terrorists were experimenting with TATP, that is triacetone triperoxide, infamously known as Mother of Satan. Why that name? Because TATP can detonate from even a small rise in temperature, friction, shaking, even the wrong chemical ratio. It's made from household chemicals, acetone, hydrogen peroxide, and acids. No commercial detonators needed, hard to detect, easy to assemble. But extremely volatile. So volatile that it likely caused the premature blast in Kashmir and the unpredictable detonation near Red Fort. Terror outfits appear to be shifting towards undetectable DIY explosives that makes the threat landscape deeply unpredictable. Adding fuel to an already volatile situation, Jaish-e-Mohammed has now issued fresh threats against India, claiming without evidence that over 1,000 sleeper cells are active within our borders. This is not just psychological warfare, it's an attempt to create fear, mistrust, and panic. So what now? How are we going to respond to this situation? Because here's the thing, India isn't responding in silence. Lieutenant General Manoj Katiyar in a recent address dropped the first hint. Not long after, Army Chief General Upendra Dwivedi echoed the same tone, a tone we have heard before. So when you combine repeated attacks on civilians, growing internal chaos across Pakistan, an economy running on borrowed time, water scarcity turning into a national emergency, and a military that's losing grip even within its own borders, you have to wonder, how long can a country survive like this? How long before the cracks turn into a collapse? And if Pakistan keeps choosing the same path, funding terror, exporting instability, and provoking India, then the question is no longer will India respond, but how soon? Are we witnessing the final stretch of a 78-year feud? Are we nearing a point where India may be forced to end the cycle once and for all? Because history shows us one truth: where terror crosses a line, India doesn't want twice.